The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Clarence's house, casting long shadows across the elegant bedroom. Camilla stirred slowly, her hand reaching across the bed to find Charles's side already cool and empty. He had left early again for another round of royal duties, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the clothes from the previous evening draped carelessly over the mahogany chair. She stretched languidly, allowing herself a few more moments of peaceful solitude before the day's responsibilities would claim her attention. The household staff would be arriving soon, and there would be the usual flurry of activity that accompanied their daily routines. But for now, in these quiet moments, she could simply be herself rather than the Duchess of Cornwall that the world expected her to be. Rising from the bed, Camilla wrapped her silk robe around her shoulders and padded across the thick carpet to where Charles's dinner jacket hung. It was a habit she had developed over the years, checking his pockets before sending his clothes to be cleaned. Charles, despite his meticulous nature in public, could be surprisingly absent-minded about personal items. She had found everything from important correspondence to forgotten reading glasses tucked away in various pockets over the years. Her fingers moved methodically through the familiar routine, checking the breast pocket first, then the side pockets. The left pocket yielded nothing more than a handkerchief, monogrammed with his initials in elegant script. The right pocket, however, contained something that made her pause. Her fingers closed around a small, hard object, and when she withdrew her hand, she found herself staring at a delicate gold earring. The piece was exquisite, clearly expensive, with a design that spoke of careful craftsmanship and refined taste. A small diamond caught the morning light, sparkling with an intensity that seemed almost accusatory in the quiet room. Camilla turned the earring over in her palm, examining every detail with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years navigating the complex world of royal jewelry and protocol. This was not hers. She was absolutely certain of that fact. While she owned many beautiful pieces, each one was cataloged in her memory with the precision of someone who understood that jewelry, in royal circles, was never merely decorative. Each piece told a story, marked an occasion, or carried significance that extended far beyond its monetary value. This earring, beautiful as it was completely foreign to her collection. A cold sensation began to spread through her chest, starting as a small knot of unease and gradually expanding until it felt difficult to breathe normally. She sank onto the edge of the bed, still holding the earring, her mind racing through possible explanations. Perhaps it had fallen from someone's ear during one of the numerous social functions they attended. Maybe it had been picked up by Charles with the intention of returning it to its rightful owner, a simple act of courtesy that he had then forgotten about. But even as she tried to convince herself of these innocent explanations, doubt gnawed at her. The earring had been in his pocket, not loose among other items, but deliberately placed there, as if it held some significance. The weight of it in her palm seemed to mock her attempts at rational thought, and she found herself studying it again, as if the jewelry itself might reveal the identity of its owner. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her quickly close her fist around the earring. She recognized the measured pace of Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, making her morning rounds. In a few moments, there would be a discreet knock on the door, followed by the quiet efficiency of the household staff beginning their daily duties. She needed to compose herself before then, to present the calm, collected demeanor that everyone expected from her. But composure felt impossible at this moment. The earring seemed to burn against her palm, and her thoughts kept circling back to the same troubling questions. Who did it belong to? How had Charles come to have it? And, perhaps most importantly, why had he said nothing to her about finding it? She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the carefully manicured gardens below. The grounds were peaceful in the early morning light, with only the gardeners moving quietly among the flower beds, their work a comforting reminder that life continued in its normal patterns even when her world felt suddenly uncertain. But the tranquil scene did little to calm her racing thoughts. Camilla had always prided herself on being a practical woman, someone who faced difficulties with courage and determination rather than dwelling on fears and suppositions. She had weathered public scandals, media scrutiny, and the complex challenges of marrying into the royal family with grace and resilience. But this small piece of jewelry had shaken her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. The irony was not lost on her that such a tiny object could carry such weight. She had seen how the smallest details could become magnified in royal life, how innocent actions could be misconstrued and private moments could become public controversies. The thought of what this earring might represent, what stories it might tell if it fell into the wrong hands, filled her with a dread that she struggled to suppress. She opened her palm again and studied the earring in the growing daylight. The craftsmanship was indeed exceptional, the kind of work that suggested it had come from one of the finest jewelers in London. The setting was classic yet modern, the kind of piece that would appeal to a woman of sophisticated taste. Someone had chosen this earring with care, had perhaps worn it to special occasions, had valued it enough to notice when it went missing. The knock she had been expecting came softly at the door, followed by Mrs. Henderson's respectful voice asking if she needed assistance with anything this morning. Camilla quickly slipped the earring into the pocket of her robe and called out that she would be ready shortly. Her voice sounded normal to her ears, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside, and she was grateful for the years of training that had taught her to maintain composure under pressure. After Mrs. Henderson's footsteps had faded down the corridor, Camilla returned to the bed and sat heavily on its edge. She needed to think clearly about what to do next. The simple act of confronting Charles about the earring felt fraught with implications that she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. Their relationship, built on years of shared understanding and mutual respect, suddenly felt fragile in the face of this small but significant mystery. She thought about their recent interactions, searching her memory for any signs that might explain the presence of the earring. Charles had been his usual self, perhaps a bit more distracted than normal, but that was hardly unusual given the constant demands on his time and attention. He had been kind and affectionate, sharing the small details of his days and asking about hers with a genuine interest that had always been one of his most endearing qualities. But now those same interactions took on a different quality in her mind. Had there been moments when he seemed distant? Times when his attention appeared to be elsewhere? She found herself analyzing conversations and gestures with a scrutiny that felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship suddenly seemed less solid than she had believed. The morning light grew stronger as she sat there, lost in thought. Soon, Charles would return from his morning appointments, and she would need to decide whether to confront him immediately or to wait, to gather more information before making accusations that could not be taken back. The earring remained hidden in her robe pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the uncertainty that had suddenly entered her life. She rose finally and moved toward her dressing room, her steps automatic despite the chaos in her mind. The day would proceed as planned, with its scheduled appointments and social obligations. She would dress carefully, apply her makeup with the same attention to detail that had become second nature, and present herself to the world as the composed, confident woman that everyone expected to see. But underneath the polished exterior, questions would continue to multiply, and the small gold earring would remain a tangible symbol of everything she thought she knew but could no longer be certain about. The discovery had changed something fundamental in her understanding of her life, and she knew that nothing would be quite the same until she found the answer she needed. As she selected her clothes for the day, her hand unconsciously moved to the pocket of her robe, feeling the outline of the earring through the silk fabric. Such a small thing, she thought, to have such power to disrupt a life that had seemed so secure just hours before. But she also knew that it was often the smallest things that revealed the largest truths, and she was no longer sure she was prepared for what this particular truth might turn out to be. The distant sound of car doors closing in the courtyard below told her that Charles had returned earlier than expected. Soon, he would be making his way upstairs, perhaps humming quietly to himself as he often did after successful meetings, unaware that his wife had stumbled upon something that could change everything between them. Camilla took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever conversation lay ahead, and tried to summon the courage that had carried her through so many challenges before. But this felt different. This was personal in a way that public scrutiny had never been, touching on the very core of the relationship that had become the center of her world. As she heard Charles's familiar footsteps on the stairs, growing closer with each passing second, she realized that the next few hours would determine not just the explanation for a mysterious earring, but the future of everything she held most dear. Charles entered their bedroom with his characteristic quiet confidence, loosening his tie as he crossed the threshold. His face bore the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully navigated another morning of royal obligations, and he offered Camilla a warm smile as he noticed her standing by the window, already dressed for the day. "Good morning, darling," he said, moving toward his wardrobe with the easy familiarity of their shared domestic routine. "The meeting with the housing ministers went rather well, I think. There's genuine enthusiasm for the Sustainable Communities project, and Lord Hampton believes we can secure additional funding by autumn." Camilla watched him in silence, the earring feeling like a burning coal in her pocket. His manner was exactly as it always was, warm and attentive, with no trace of guilt or anxiety in his demeanor. Either he was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, or he possessed acting abilities that she had never suspected. The uncertainty made her feel slightly nauseous, and she realized that her hands were trembling slightly. "Charles," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected, "I need to ask you about something." He paused in the act of hanging up his jacket, turning to look at her with mild curiosity. "Of course. What is it?" His tone was casual, but she caught a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps wariness, though it could have been nothing more than her own heightened imagination reading significance into innocent reactions. She withdrew the earring from her pocket, holding it up so that the morning light caught the diamond and sent sparkles dancing across the bedroom walls. "I found this in your dinner jacket pocket this morning. It's not mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's expression underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation, the easy confidence fading to be replaced by something more complex. His eyes fixed on the earring with an intensity that confirmed her worst fears even before he spoke. This was not the reaction of a man encountering an unfamiliar object that had somehow found its way into his possession by innocent means. "Where exactly did you find that?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the underlying tension despite his attempts to maintain composure. He moved closer, his eyes never leaving the piece of jewelry, and she noticed that his hands had formed loose fists to the sides. "In your right pocket, when I was checking before sending the jacket to be cleaned," Camilla replied, her own voice growing firmer as she recognized that her suspicions were being confirmed by his reaction. "It was deliberate, Charles, not something that fell there by accident. You placed it there." Charles reached out as if to take the earring from her, but she closed her fingers around it and stepped back. The small motion seemed to communicate volumes about the shift in their relationship dynamic, and she saw him recognize the significance immediately. Trust, once broken, could not be restored by simple explanations or casual dismissals. "Camilla, please," he began, his voice taking on a pleading quality that she had rarely heard before. "This isn't what you think. I can explain everything." "Then explain," she said simply, settling into the chair by the window with the deliberate poise of someone preparing for a long and difficult conversation. "Tell me whose earring this is and how it came to be in your pocket. Tell me why you said nothing to me about finding it. Tell me everything." Charles ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she recognized as a sign of severe stress. He began to pace the length of the bedroom, his movements restless and agitated, so unlike his usual controlled demeanor. The transformation was alarming in its completeness, as if the man she thought she knew had been replaced by someone unfamiliar and unpredictable. "Her name is Diana Thornfield," he said finally, the words emerging with obvious reluctance. "She's the cultural attaché at the Australian Embassy. We met at the reception for the Commonwealth Arts Festival last month." Camilla felt the name settle into her consciousness like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples of implication and fear throughout her entire being. Diana Thornfield. She tried to recall the name from recent social events, to match it with a face from the endless stream of diplomatic functions and cultural gatherings they attended, but nothing came immediately to mind. "Go on," she said, her voice betraying none of the emotional turmoil that was building inside her chest. "She's brilliant," Charles continued, still pacing, his words coming faster now as if a dam had burst. "Educated at Oxford, specialized in Renaissance literature, speaks 4 languages fluently. We talked for hours that night about art restoration and cultural preservation. She has insights into the intersection of historical preservation and modern accessibility that I've never heard articulated so clearly." With each word, Camilla felt her heart sink further. This was not the description of a casual acquaintance or a brief encounter. This was the voice of a man who had been deeply affected by another woman, who had found in her something that spoke to his intellectual passions and personal interests in ways that perhaps his wife had not done recently. "And the earring?" she prompted, though she was beginning to suspect that she already knew the answer. Charles stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. "We've met several times since then. For coffee, for walks in the park, to discuss various cultural initiatives. Always innocent, always in public places. But last week," he paused, struggling with the words. "Last week, she invited me to her apartment to see a collection of medieval manuscripts that her embassy had acquired for a special exhibition." The room seemed to spin slightly around Camilla as the implications of his words sank in. An apartment visit. Private time away from the public eye, away from the protective presence of security details and social expectations. The kind of privacy that allowed for intimate conversations and perhaps more intimate contact. "She made dinner," Charles continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Nothing elaborate, just pasta and wine. We talked about literature, about the manuscripts, about the loneliness that sometimes comes with public life. She understood, Camilla. She understood in a way that I don't." Camilla finished the sentence for him, her voice sharp with hurt and anger. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, but the damage was already done. The implication hung in the air between them like an accusation. "So what happened?" she asked, though part of her desperately wanted to stop the conversation before it went any further. "How did her earring end up in your pocket?" Charles moved to the window, staring out at the gardens as if the carefully cultivated landscape might provide him with the words he needed. "We kissed," he said finally, so quietly that she almost didn't hear him. "Nothing more than that, I swear to you. But when we were saying goodbye, her earring caught on my jacket and came off. I picked it up and put it in my pocket, intending to return it to her." The confession hung between them like a physical presence, changing the very air in the room. Camilla found herself struggling to breathe normally, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of betrayal and disappointment. The man she had married, the man she had believed herself to know completely, had been living a secret life that included romantic encounters with other women. "Just a kiss?" she asked, her voice hollow with disbelief. "You expect me to believe that you've been carrying on some kind of emotional affair with another woman, meeting her privately in her apartment, and nothing happened beyond a single kiss?" "It's the truth," Charles insisted, turning back to face her with an expression of desperate sincerity. "Camilla, you have to believe me. I never intended for any of this to happen. Diana and we connected intellectually, yes, and perhaps I was flattered by her attention and interest in my work. But it never went beyond that one moment of weakness." "One moment of weakness," Camilla repeated, testing the phrase on her tongue, and finding it inadequate to describe the devastation she felt. Is that what you call it when you betray your marriage vows and risk everything we've built together? She stood and began her own restless movement around the room, the earring still clutched in her fist like evidence in a trial that was just beginning. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every personal item that filled their shared space suddenly seemed to mock the stability she had thought she possessed. How many other secrets might be hiding in this room, in this life that she had believed she understood? I haven't seen her since that night, Charles said, following her movement with his eyes. I've deliberately avoided events where I knew she would be present. I ended it immediately, Camilla. I realized what I was risking, and I ended it. But you kept the earring, she pointed out, the accusation clear in her voice. You didn't mail it back to her. You didn't have someone from your staff return it. You didn't find any of the dozen ways you could have returned it without seeing her again. You kept it. The accuracy of her observation seemed to deflate him visibly. His shoulders sagged, and he sank into the chair she had vacated, suddenly, looking every year of his age. You're right, he admitted. I kept it because it reminded me of that evening, of feeling young and intellectually stimulated, and he trailed off, perhaps realizing that his explanation was only making things worse. And what? Camilla demanded, her anger finally breaking through her attempts at control. Of feeling things with her that you don't feel with me? Of having conversations that we never have? Of being understood in ways that I apparently fail to understand you? That's not fair, Charles protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Camilla shot back. You've just told me that you found this woman brilliant and stimulating, that she understood aspects of your life that I presumably don't, that you were so enchanted by her company that you forgot your marriage vows long enough to kiss her in her apartment. How exactly is my interpretation unfair? Charles buried his face in his hands, and for a moment the only sound in the room was their labored breathing and the distant noise of London traffic filtering through the windows. The weight of decades of marriage, of shared struggles, and public scrutiny of building a life together against enormous odds seemed to press down on them both with crushing force. I don't know what you want me to say, he said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. I made a terrible mistake. I allowed myself to be flattered and charmed by someone who seemed to offer something different from our usual routine. I compromised our marriage, and I betrayed your trust. I know there's nothing I can say that will undo the damage I've done. Camilla stopped her pacing and studied her husband, seeing him perhaps more clearly than she had in years. The man who had seemed so confident and self-assured just minutes earlier now looked broken and, ashamed, diminished by the weight of his confession. But beneath her anger and hurt, she found herself recognizing something else. The lonely, aging man who had perhaps been seeking validation and excitement in ways that his carefully regulated royal life rarely provided. Do you love her? She asked quietly, the question emerging from some deep place of need to understand the full extent of the threat to her marriage. Charles looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. I thought I might, he admitted. For a few brief weeks, I allowed myself to imagine what it might be like to have that kind of intellectual and emotional connection with someone. But no, Camilla, I don't love her. What I feel for you, what we've built together, it's deeper and more real than anything I could ever have with Diana Thornfield. The admission should have been comforting, but Camilla found it raised as many questions as it answered. If he didn't love this other woman, what did that say about the state of their own relationship? If he had been willing to risk everything they had for someone he barely knew, what did that suggest about his satisfaction with their marriage? I need time to think, she said finally, the earring still warm from her clenched fist. I need to decide what this means for us, what we do from here. Charles nodded, seeming to understand that any attempt to rush her decision or minimize the significance of his betrayal would only make things worse. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk again. But as Camilla left the bedroom, she wondered if ready was a state she would ever reach again. The foundation of trust that had supported their marriage had been cracked, perhaps irreparably, and she was no longer certain that either of them possessed the tools necessary to rebuild it. The following days passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt more exhausting than any crisis Camilla had previously endured. She and Charles maintained their public schedules, attending state functions and charity events with the practiced ease of people who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing united while their private world crumbled. The irony was not lost on her that their greatest acting challenge had nothing to do with cameras or crowds, and everything to do with pretending to each other that their marriage remained intact. But behind a facade of continuity, Camilla found herself consumed by a need to understand the full scope of what had happened between Charles and Diana Thornfield. The earring had become both symbol and catalyst, representing not just a moment of betrayal, but a gateway into questions about her marriage that she had never thought to ask. Sleep eluded her most nights as she lay next to Charles, listening to his breathing and wondering what thoughts occupied his dreams. She began her investigation with characteristic discretion, using the extensive network of contacts she had cultivated over years of royal duty. Lady Margaret Worthington, who served on the board of several cultural organizations and attended nearly every diplomatic function in London, proved to be an invaluable source of information about Diana Thornfield's presence in London society. "Oh yes, the Australian attaché," Margaret had said during their carefully casual tea at Fortnum's. "Quite striking, actually. Blonde, tall, very well educated. She's made quite an impression at several recent events. I remember thinking she seemed rather focused on the cultural preservation initiatives that Prince Charles has been championing. Very knowledgeable about the subject." The description settled into Camilla's mind like a photograph developing in slow motion. Blonde, tall, well-educated, and specifically interested in Charles's work. The profile of a woman who would naturally appeal to her husband's intellectual vanity and desire for meaningful conversation about his passions. She found herself constructing an image of this woman, imagining how she might have looked at Charles with admiring eyes while discussing Renaissance manuscripts and cultural policy. "Has she attended many events recently?" Camilla had asked, keeping her tone light and conversational. "Not in the past few weeks, now that you mention it," Margaret replied thoughtfully, which is unusual because she was quite visible at functions throughout the spring and early summer. Perhaps she's been traveling for the embassy, or maybe she's simply been busy with other duties. The information aligned perfectly with Charles's claim that he had avoided events where Diana might be present, adding credibility to at least that part of his story. But it also raised new questions about the woman herself. Why had she suddenly withdrawn from the social circuit? Was she perhaps dealing with her own guilt and confusion about what had transpired between them? Camilla's next avenue of investigation took her to the Commonwealth Arts Festival records, ostensibly to review the success of the event for future planning purposes. The guest list and photographs from that evening in May provided her first glimpse of Diana Thornfield in person, and the sight of the woman hit her with unexpected force. Diana was indeed striking, with the kind of classical beauty that photographed well and commanded attention in crowded rooms. But more than her physical appearance, there was something in her captured expression, in the way she held herself, that spoke of intelligence and confidence. In one particular photograph, she was engaged in animated conversation with Charles, both of them leaning slightly forward with the body language of people completely absorbed in their discussion. Camilla stared at the photograph for a long time, studying every detail of the interaction. Charles's expression was one she recognized, the look of genuine intellectual engagement that had initially attracted her to him decades earlier. But seeing it directed toward another woman, captured permanently in this damning image, felt like discovering evidence of an emotional infidelity that extended far beyond the physical betrayal he had confessed to. The photograph also revealed details about Diana's jewelry that evening, including what appeared to be the matching earring to the one Camilla had discovered. The woman had worn them to an event where she first met Charles, perhaps chosen them specifically because she understood their elegant design would catch the light and draw attention. The calculation in such a choice, if it was indeed calculated, suggested a level of deliberate seduction that made Camilla's blood run cold. Her investigation expanded to include conversations with other embassy staff and cultural organization members, always framed as innocent inquiries about potential future collaborations. Through these carefully orchestrated discussions, she learned that Diana Thornfield was indeed regarded as exceptionally bright and professionally capable. She had authored several papers on cultural preservation policies and was considered a rising star in diplomatic circles. But she also discovered that Diana had a reputation for forming intense intellectual connections with prominent men in London's cultural establishment. Lord Pemberton, who served on the British Museum Board, mentioned that she had developed close working relationships with several male colleagues on various preservation projects. The description was diplomatically phrased, but Camilla detected undertones that suggested Diana's professional networking might extend into more personal territory. "She's the type of woman," Lady Hamilton confided during a charity luncheon, "who makes men feel as if they're the most fascinating person in the room. Very clever that way. I've watched her work a room, and she has an uncanny ability to identify the most influential men present and engage them in conversations about their specific interests and passions." The comment crystallized something that Camilla had been struggling to articulate about her growing understanding of what had happened between Charles and Diana. This had not been a chance encounter between two people who happened to connect. Diana Thornfield was a woman who deliberately cultivated relationships with powerful men, using her intelligence and charm as tools for personal and professional advancement. The realization should have made Camilla feel better about Charles's susceptibility to Diana's attention, framing him as the victim of a calculated seduction rather than an active participant in betraying his marriage. But instead, she found herself feeling worse. If Diana was indeed a practiced manipulator of male ego and vanity, what did it say about Charles's emotional state that he had been so easily captured by her tactics? Camilla began to examine her own marriage with new eyes, looking for signs of the vulnerability that Diana had apparently exploited. Had Charles been feeling underappreciated or intellectually starved? Had their relationship fallen into routines that left him craving the kind of focused attention and admiration that an ambitious woman like Diana could provide? The questions led her to uncomfortable realizations about the gradual changes in their relationship over recent years. They still loved each other, she was certain of that, but perhaps they had begun to take each other for granted in ways that created openings for outside influence. Charles's work had always been important to him, but maybe she had stopped engaging with it as enthusiastically as she once had. Perhaps their conversations had become too focused on logistics and public duties, leaving little room for the deeper intellectual and emotional connection that had originally brought them together. She decided to visit Diana's apartment building, driving past it several times to get a sense of the environment where the betrayal had occurred. It was an elegant Georgian townhouse in Belgravia, converted into luxury flats, exactly the sort of address that would appeal to diplomatic personnel with sophisticated tastes. The building's discreet entrance and quiet street provided the perfect setting for private dinners and intimate conversations away from the scrutiny that followed Charles everywhere else. Standing across the street, looking up at the windows that might belong to Diana's flat, Camilla tried to imagine the evening Charles had described. The dinner, the wine, the conversation about medieval manuscripts, and the loneliness of public life. The gradual shift from professional discussion to personal revelation. The moment when intellectual connection transformed into physical attraction. The kiss that had changed everything. The image filled her with a mixture of rage and devastating sadness. Not just because of the betrayal itself, but because it represented everything she and Charles seemed to have lost without noticing. When had they stopped having conversations that lasted for hours? When had they stopped discovering new things about each other that sparked excitement and deeper connection? She drove home through the London traffic, The earring, now permanently residing in her jewelry box, where she could examine it whenever the need to understand overtook her rational mind. It had become a talisman of sorts, a physical reminder that her marriage was more fragile than she had believed, and that trust, once broken, could not be restored simply through apologies and promises. That evening, she confronted Charles with some of what she had learned, not as accusations, but as attempts to understand the full scope of what had happened between them. His reactions confirmed much of what she suspected about Diana's character and methods, but they also revealed the depth of his own dissatisfaction with aspects of their relationship that he had never previously articulated. She made me feel as if my work mattered in ways that I hadn't felt in years, he admitted during one of their late-night conversations. Not just as duty or obligation, but as genuine passion that could make a difference in the world. I know that sounds pathetic, but it was intoxicating to have someone hang on every word about cultural preservation and historical significance. And I don't do that anymore, Camilla asked, though she already knew the answer. You do, of course you do, Charles said quickly, but perhaps not with the same intensity. Not with the sense that these ideas are new and exciting possibilities rather than familiar territory we've covered many times before. The honesty of his response was both helpful and devastating. They had indeed fallen into patterns of familiarity that, while comfortable, had perhaps drained some of the intellectual excitement from their relationship. Diana had offered Charles something that felt new and stimulating, even if it was ultimately illusory. So what do we do now? Camilla asked as they sat in their bedroom, the space where the discovery had first shattered their sense of security. I don't know, Charles replied with an honesty that was more frightening than any lie might have been. I know I want to rebuild what we've damaged, but I'm not certain either of us knows how to do that. Camilla looked at him across the distance that seemed to have opened between them despite their physical proximity, and realized that the earring had been just the beginning. The real work of understanding what had gone wrong in their marriage and what it would take to repair it was only just starting, and she was no longer certain that either of them possessed the emotional tools necessary for the reconstruction that would be required. 3 months after the discovery of the earring, Camilla found herself standing in the same bedroom where her world had first begun to unravel, but the space felt fundamentally different now. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated a room that looked identical to before, yet every object within it carried the weight of conversations, confessions, and careful reconstruction that had taken place since that devastating morning. The earring itself had been returned to Diana Thornfield through diplomatic channels, a formal gesture that marked the official end of whatever connection had existed between the Australian attaché and Charles. Diana had since been transferred to a posting in Singapore, a development that Camilla chose to interpret as evidence that the embassy had decided a change of scenery was advisable for their cultural attaché. Whether the transfer was Diana's choice or her superiors remained unclear, but Camilla found she no longer cared about such details. The weeks following her investigation had been some of the most difficult of their marriage, filled with painful honesty about things they had both allowed to deteriorate through benign neglect. Charles had been devastated by the full extent of Camilla's hurt. Finally, understanding that his actions had threatened not just their marriage, but her fundamental sense of self-worth and security. The man who could navigate complex diplomatic situations with ease had seemed lost when faced with the emotional wreckage he had created in his own home. But something unexpected had emerged from their mutual determination to understand what had gone wrong. Their conversations, initially fraught with hurt and recrimination, had gradually evolved into something deeper and more honest than anything they had shared in years. They began to rediscover each other as individuals rather than simply as partners in the elaborate dance of royal duty and public service. I think I forgot how to see you, Charles had said during one of their evening talks in the library, surrounded by the books and comfortable silence that had always defined their most intimate moments. Not because you changed, but because I stopped paying attention to who you are when you're not being the Duchess of Cornwall. The observation had stung initially, but Camilla recognized its truth. They had both become so focused on their public roles and responsibilities that they had allowed their private relationship to become routine, predictable, drained of the curiosity and excitement that had originally brought them together. Diana Thornfield had offered Charles something that felt forbidden and thrilling precisely because it existed outside the careful boundaries of royal protocol and established routine. "And I think I stopped expecting you to surprise me," Camilla had responded. "I became so comfortable with thinking I knew exactly who you are and what you needed that I forgot to keep discovering new things about you." Their reconstruction began with small changes that felt both artificial and necessary. They instituted regular dinners without staff present, cooking simple meals together and talking about books, ideas, and observations that had nothing to do with their official duties. Charles began sharing drafts of his speeches with her again, not just for feedback on protocol, but for genuine intellectual engagement with the ideas he was trying to communicate. Camilla, for her part, began attending some of his cultural preservation meetings, not as the dutiful royal spouse, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding his passion for the work. She discovered aspects of his thinking and vision that had been hidden beneath years of familiar assumptions, and found herself falling in love again with his idealism and commitment to making lasting change. The process was not without setbacks. There were evenings when the weight of betrayal and hurt threatened to overwhelm their progress. When Camilla found herself searching Charles's face for signs of the man who had been capable of such deception. There were moments when Charles's guilt manifested as overcompensation that felt forced and uncomfortable, when his efforts to prove his devotion became performative rather than genuine. But gradually, something more authentic began to emerge. They learned to talk about the Diana Thornfield affair not as a shameful secret that threatened their marriage, but as a crisis that had revealed important truths about their relationship that needed addressing. Charles's susceptibility to another woman's attention became a starting point for discussions about what they both needed emotionally and intellectually from their partnership. "I don't want you to feel guilty forever about what happened," Camilla told him one evening as they walked through the gardens of Highgrove, the setting sun painting everything in warm golden light. "But I also don't want us to pretend it never happened or that it doesn't matter. I want us to understand why it happened so we can make sure it never happens again." Charles had stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious, but no longer haunted by the shame that had characterized his demeanor in the immediate aftermath of his confession. "I think I was trying to feel young again," he said. "Not just physically young, but intellectually and emotionally young. Diana made me feel as if I was still capable of surprising myself, of having new thoughts and experiences that could change who I am. And you thought you couldn't have that with me?" Camilla asked, though the question no longer carried the sting it would have months earlier. "I think I thought our relationship was finished growing," Charles replied honestly. "I thought we had become who we were going to be together, and that the excitement of discovery was behind us. Diana represented possibility in a way that felt impossible within our established patterns." The conversation had been a turning point, helping them both understand that their marriage didn't have to be a fixed entity that could only maintain what it had already achieved. They could continue to grow and change together, to surprise each other and themselves without seeking those experiences outside their relationship. They began traveling together differently, choosing destinations and activities based on shared curiosity rather than official obligations. A weekend in Bath became an exploration of Georgian architecture and social history that sparked conversations lasting well into the night. A visit to Scotland transformed from royal duty into a genuine investigation of ancient clan traditions and their relevance to modern cultural identity. Camilla also began developing her own intellectual interests more seriously, joining a reading group focused on contemporary literature and enrolling in an online course about art history that she had always meant to pursue. Charles's encouragement of these activities felt different from his previous polite support, carrying genuine enthusiasm for her growth as an individual. The change was noticed by others in their circle. Lady Margaret Worthington remarked during a charity function that they seemed more engaged with each other, more present in their interactions. Staff members at their various residences observed that they spent more time together in comfortable silence, reading or working on separate projects while sharing the same space. But perhaps the most significant change was in how they handled conflict and disagreement. Instead of the polite avoidance that had characterized their previous approach to marital friction, they learned to address differences directly while maintaining respect for each other's perspectives. Arguments, when they occurred, became opportunities for deeper understanding rather than threats to their stability. 6 months after the discovery of the earring, Camilla received a letter forwarded through diplomatic channels. Diana Thornfield had written to express her regret for any complications her friendship with Charles might have caused, and to assure Camilla that nothing inappropriate had occurred between them. The letter was carefully worded and diplomatically neutral, but Camilla detected genuine remorse beneath the formal language. She showed the letter to Charles, and they discussed Diana's motivations for writing it. Had she been experiencing guilt about her role in their marital crisis? Had someone advised her that reaching out might help resolve lingering diplomatic awkwardness? Or was she perhaps seeking absolution for her own peace of mind? Does it matter? Charles asked after they had analyzed every possible interpretation of Diana's gesture. Camilla realized that it didn't matter at all. Diana Thornfield had become irrelevant to their marriage, not because her actions had been forgiven or forgotten, but because she and Charles had used the crisis she had precipitated to build something stronger than what they had possessed before. The other woman's motivations and feelings were no longer part of their story. A year after the discovery, they celebrated their wedding anniversary with a private dinner at home, prepared together and eaten by candlelight in their private dining room. The anniversary had always been important to them, but this year it felt like a genuine celebration of survival and renewal rather than simply an acknowledgement of time past. "I keep thinking about that morning when you found the earring," Charles said as they shared a bottle of wine that had been aging in their cellar for decades. "How terrified I was that I had destroyed everything we'd built together." "I was terrified too," Camilla replied. "But I think I was more terrified of discovering that our marriage was fragile enough to be threatened by another woman's attention than I was of the attention itself." They had learned that their marriage was indeed fragile in some ways, but also more resilient than either had previously understood. The fragility came from taking each other for granted, from assuming that love was sufficient without ongoing effort to maintain connection and growth. But the resilience came from their fundamental compatibility and their shared commitment to working through difficulties rather than abandoning the relationship when it faced challenges. Do you think we would have figured out what was missing if the Diana situation hadn't happened? Camilla asked. Charles considered the question seriously. "I think we might have continued as we were for years, comfortable but gradually growing more distant, until something else forced us to examine what we had allowed to deteriorate. In some ways, as horrible as it was to go through, that crisis may have saved our marriage by making us address problems before they became insurmountable." Later that evening, as they prepared for bed in the room where the discovery had first shattered their sense of security, Camilla felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had taken together over the past year. Not gratitude for the betrayal itself, which had been genuinely painful and destructive, but for their mutual determination to use the crisis as an opportunity for growth rather than an excuse for giving up. The earring was gone, returned to its owner, and removed from their lives. But the lessons it had taught them about attention, appreciation, and the ongoing work required to maintain a vital marriage had become permanent parts of their relationship. They had learned to see each other with fresh eyes, to remain curious about each other's inner lives, and to create space for continued growth and change within their partnership. As she settled into sleep beside Charles, Camilla reflected on how different their relationship felt now compared to a year ago. They were still the same people, facing the same external pressures and responsibilities that had always defined their public lives. But privately, they had become explorers again, discovering new territories within themselves and each other that they had forgotten existed. The betrayal had been real, and its effect had been devastating in ways that would always remain part of their shared history. But they had chosen to let it teach them rather than destroy them, to use it as a foundation for building something stronger rather than as evidence that their marriage was doomed to fail. In the end, perhaps that choice was the most important victory they could have achieved.